Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone. My name is Sinta Khoiriyah. I'm from English Education Department, Pekalongan University, and I would like to present my article entitled Students' Perception on Poetry in Learning English Literature, a case study at the 11th graders measuring science at SMA Wandoro. Part 1, Introduction. Start by background. Literature in English teaching is very important. The scope of literature is wide. Not only learn about text, but we also learn about the history, culture, and language. But this is not fully outlined by the students. Several problems emerged and form a gap between students' background knowledge of English literature and the concept of teaching English literature itself. Hamel 2013 in his research found there is low motivation among students in the conception of understanding literature. They're not fully interpreted in the class, so it's hard for a teacher to motivate them. Such as happened in SMA Wandoro, where students' learning motivation in English literature is still low. Using 2013 curriculum, for the grades 11 and 12, many students not interested in learning literature. They suggest that literature rather complicated than English in general. This problem makes the writers interested to conduct the research entitled Students' Perception on Poetry in Learning English Literature. Based on the background, I conclude the problem statement is first, how the students' perception on poetry. The second one, what are the students' factors of perception? Part 2 is research method. The research design used here is qualitative method with descriptive analysis. The type of approach is case study. And then this research aims to reveal students' perception on poetry. It can be positive or negative perception, stated Robbins 2002. Besides that, this research also aims to explore students' factor of perception. And then the research subject used here is the 11th grade students measuring science and mathematics of SMA Wandoro. According to Arikunta 2006, if the number of subject is so large, it can be taken between 15 up to 25%. And based on the total participant here is 72 students. So the number of subject will be 20 students. This means to avoid the bad choices that will cause invalid data, so the researcher rounded to be 20 students. For the data, there are two types of data used in this research. There are primary data. It will be the results of students' interview in the form of interview transcription, and then secondary data will be journals and articles related to the topic. Part 3, Findings and Discussion. Point A, Findings. I show Table 3.1 is the result of students' perception on poetry. Based on the table 3.1, it can be seen the percentage of students' perception as follows. Next, the finding on table 3.0, factor of students' perception. Based on the table 3.2, it can be seen the percentages of students' factor in perception. Next, point B, discussion, consists of number 1, discussion about students' perception on poetry. Point A, students difficult to understand diction. From that response, we can say that he didn't know much vocabulary in the handout because teacher chose the string English words, so it made him difficult to know the meaning of poetry. The second one, students easy to understand figurative language. Figurative language consists of many types of poetry such as hyperbole, personification, simile, and others. Based on the interview, 15% of 20 students easy to understand figurative language by poetry. It can be seen from one of student respond, "Yes, I understood the figurative language and I got to distinguish that, for example, personification is equalize the object to." Point 3 is students difficult to play imagination. Imagination cannot be separated from poetry. From that perception, it can be said that she hard to imagine because the poetry is long. So she just skipped the words and waiting for the teacher to explain. And point 4, students easy to understand theme. Theme of poetry is important because it's the main key of poetry. The dominant result of interview state 100% of 20 students argued theme of poetry by the teacher was appropriate for senior high school student. Point 5. Students easy to apply feeling. Feeling is identical with poetry. Based on the interview, 60% of 20 students easy to feel the poetry because they fun when learning poetry. They enthusiastic to learn a new type of poetry. Point 6. Teacher never thought biographical element. Biographical element is extrinsic element. Based on the interview, 55% of 20 students state teacher never thought biographical element of poetry. Besides the discussion about students' perception, the second discussion will be student factor of perception. First is internal factor. Internal factor that influence good perception consists of students' attitude and attention. Number 1, attitude. Based on the interview, 65% of 20 students said they have good behavior in joint poetry class. Okay, besides positive perception, internal factor also influence negative perception. First is interest. Based on the interview, 65% of students said they're not interested in learning poetry. Based on the interview, 55% of 20 students said they low motivation to learn poetry. We can see the finding. There was no motivation from me. Point 3, experience. Based on the interview, 70% of 20 students have not have interesting experience related poetry. Beside internal factor, there are also external factor. Point B. External factor that influence in positive perception is point 1, teacher. Based on the interview, 80% of 20 students state the teacher was good. She is not alteration in teaching poetry. Number 2 is method. Based on the interview, 75% of students say the method was good. It was various methods applied by the teacher. From that perception, we can say that teacher often applied, discuss in the class. She not use reading comprehension, but she also tried to practice listening and speaking. External factors also influence negative perception. It influenced by students' environment. Based on the interview, 55% of 20 students said that their families didn't support them to learn poetry. Meanwhile, 70% of 20 students said their friends also not provide significant support to learn poetry. Based on the result, there are 4 positive perception. Students was easy to understand figurative language. The theme of poetry was appropriate. Learning poetry was fun, and teacher thought philosophical element of poetry. While there are also 4 negative perception. Diction in poetry was difficult to understand. Students difficult to apply imagination on poetry. Teacher didn't provide biographical element, and teacher didn't thought sociological element on poetry. Okay, it's all about my presentation. So if you have any question, you can feel free to ask. You can comment in this channel. Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks for the attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.